And hey, welcome, Shashwat. Wonderful to have you here in this conversation. Uh, you know, you're one of those, really young leaders that the country is looking up to take India to a leadership position, by the time we touch India at 100. So I think it's a large responsibility in one way, but also an opportunity to imagine, what India's journey over the next 20, 21 years will be like, and really how India can, shape its own future and destiny through the right actions, working around the right themes with like-minded people, like-minded citizens, but also engaging deeply with the world, as we go about doing that. And given that, your group is now building large global businesses and, looking at how that is shaping up, also in areas which are critically important, not only for the survival of the planet through your renewable energy focus, but even others that, today are becoming increasingly more important, when we see geopolitical pressures, we see supply chain challenges, and so many others, that we will have over the coming years. So look forward to a exciting conversation. And as I was mentioning earlier, this is something you speak your mind. We'll make it a conversation, and hopefully snippets from this conversation will be used both by CII and by multiple stakeholders in the country over the next 2 decades to kind of influence and shape some, thinking around wherever, whether at a state level, at a national level. And I think that's the power that, we see that an industry body like CII convening multiple stakeholders to shape the future of India brings to the table. So with that, I think this conversation we've had with so many people, and what always excites me and what really keeps this thing going is, imagine you're waking up, on 15th August 2047, and you look around
Mhm.
the India. What's the India you'd like to see? Like what's your dream, right? When you think of it in that light.
So, very good afternoon. Thank you so much, Rajan and CII, for having me on this platform. Truly an honor and privilege to be here. Um, India at 2047. That's a tough one. But I think if I was to try and create my own crystal ball and gaze into the future of what that 2047 would look like, um, I would see an India which is very technologically advanced, and India which is self-sustainable, self-reliant. I would look at an India that has moved to becoming one of the top three global economies in the world, and an India which is defining how the global order of the world functions.
Oh, wonderful. I think, that vision, that aspirational vision that you talked of, and you have a legacy business, Shashwat, to be able to bring that to light, right? Like how would you look at transforming, your business consists of traditional businesses, it's diversified, a lot of emerging sectors, and it's always exciting to imagine what that composition will be like, over the next 2 decades. So when you think of that transformation at your RPG group, and that, how do you see that, and what do you envision and reimagine not only your group but also a diversified Indian conglomerate to look like?
So, if I tell you a little bit about our group, right? So we've got a legacy which is over 220 years old, right? But what's very interesting is the very first businesses that we did, we are not in any of those businesses today. And I'm pretty sure my forefathers from back then wouldn't think we are in the businesses we are in today, right? So as a group, we've been a group that's always reinvented to stay relevant. And historically, a lot of this may have been through acquisitions, in a way. And so you acquire businesses which fit into what the next 20 years, 30 years would look like. And you kind of divest from businesses that you believe have finished serving their purpose, right? So just for example, we kind of started off as being um, the first traders to the East India Company, then we were bankers to the East India Company, then we were in textile trading. My forefathers were, so one of my forefathers was the first chairman of the State Bank of India when it became nationalized. And I think when you look at our businesses today, it's extremely diverse from energy to consumer to chemicals to BPO and AI to sports, media, entertainment, right? And I think the whole idea for us has always been as a group, and I think that's core to our DNA, is really how do we kind of reinvent to stay relevant, and how do you reallocate or take capital decisions so that you can ensure that you're thinking 10, 15, 20 years out, you're not thinking just quarter to quarter, right? And so if you look at our current play, it's really about building businesses which are structurally important from an India growth standpoint. So which is whether you look at it from an energy standpoint, whether you're look at it from an India consumption story playing out, right? And we've created all of the businesses to be very, if I could say so, agile, so that you kind of pivot because business models today change very quickly. There is geopolitical uncertainty that is there in today's day and age, whether it was COVID, whether it is, we saw the tariff wars earlier. Every year there is something new. So the business models have to adapt. And then there is a lot of disruption that happens in industries as well, right? So in retail, for example, from brick and mortar to e-commerce and now to 10-minute delivery, right? So it's really about how quickly can you reinvent the models and at a macro level, play in spaces which you think are themes for the next couple of decades, not just a 4 5 year scenario.
No, I think you've put it so beautifully. And, I can completely relate to it, right? Because I also come from a third generation, not 200, but a 90-year history. And our group was very different because my grandfather left, undivided India in the 1930s and went to Thailand and set up all our
Okay.
businesses there. Exactly. Trading and then manufacturing, and then invited the Birlas to come there and set up large manufacturing businesses. But when I was envisaging the next 30 years, for our group and growth, I decided that it needed to be based out of India. Two reasons. One, of course, I wanted to raise my two girls in India, but more importantly, not only with those Indian values, but the fact that India is where the future will get defined. Because whether you look at our population, 1 in 11 people in the world is an Indian under the age of 25. So not only an Indian under the age of 25. And therefore, what you opened with, that we can imagine India naturally rising to a position of global leadership and economically. And a lot of data points are not very well known, but India today contributes to 17% of the global growth, right? That is happening anywhere in the world. It's happening out of India. So the potential of this country is what is this. What we have done a little differently, maybe from you, is of course looked at new age businesses. Like you looked at energy, we are looking at digital. Of course, I know you also encompass digital and many of those, but change the business models also, because for an
Yeah.
India, you bring multiple stakeholders, different families, all collaborating to create very large businesses. Because somewhere as a country, which is the third largest economy, when we look at the world, in the top 100, we don't have enough Indian companies in the top
Independent.
500. And I think this is the time for India to be able to do that. And around that, I think you are someone who has, really built a large footprint globally, to scale your group, from where you are to where you plan to be. And when you look at global competitiveness, for example, for what you do in India or as you're, doing that globally, how do you see that difference? What's your advice to other industries which are looking at, that roadmap, and how can India truly unlock that larger potential of creating those very large businesses, over a certain period of time?
We've looked at globalization and going global with a lot of our businesses. And for us, it's always been first get your business and the business model right. And first, we've always been very clear, we're always building in India first, India for India, and then we expanded to India for the world, right? And I think we've been very focused on kind of building standards which are globally competitive. So not just attempting to be the best in India, but to set a benchmark in the world, whether it's to do with quality, whether it's to do with compliance, whether it's to do with sustainability, or cost efficiency in that matter, right? And I believe once you have that right, then you kind of have the right to expand globally. So, whether we look at First Source, which is operating globally and serving most of the Fortune 500 companies across the US, Europe, other markets, or if you're looking at our chemicals business, Aquafarm, which is the global specialty chemicals business catering to a lot of the major consumer giants out there in the world. Or if you look at our sporting franchise, which started off with the Lucknow Super Giants in the IPL, and now we've taken the Super Giants franchise to the UK in the hundreds with Manchester Super Giants and to South Africa as well. So the idea is really first build at home, build it strong, build it large, and then grow it globally.
No, I think that's and that India, whatever you say, formula, the Indianness that will go out to the world, along with, of course, the economic competitiveness, but the ability to build a business
Yeah.
with many of those Indian values, that we talk of, can be actually a new global competitive benchmark, right? Especially when it comes to, certain non-negotiables that we have to adopt in India's growth story, right? Like, I think
And
affordability, yeah, please go ahead. You had
And
some.
just to add, one of the
Yeah.
points you kind of made earlier as well is when you look at the top 100 companies globally, there are very few or almost non-existent Indian companies that kind of feature in that list. And for us, the 2050 vision is very clear: be very large in India, but be equally large for the world as well.
Yeah.
And so we are building with that vision that hopefully at least a few of our companies could feature in that list
No, no, absolutely. And I
in the
think
coming
that's that
decades.
opportunity. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the, and it's good because you in diversified areas. Let's go a little deeper into the different areas. Of course, we'll start with the
Sure.
one you're most passionate with, that's, and the world is talking of energy transition, right? And India's energy transition is probably going to be one of the most critical shifts that we're going to see over the next decade and two, given the size of our population and our needs and our ambitions, right? We want to be the data center capital, for example, for the world, for AI, etc.
Yeah.
And so many reasons for us to focus on renewables, our manufacturing capabilities. So how should India as a country, be thinking? You're operating in that environment. What should the government be doing? What are our clean energy ambitions? Is there something that Indian conglomerates, right, like yours, are leading, or others should think about, as we participate in this transition, of course, globally, but in some shape also lead it, right? At a world stage. So, any thoughts you might have around that subject?
Sure. So, I think the fact that we have to transition to greener sources of energy, I think, is but obvious and a no-brainer, right? And I think for India, a lot of it is being driven by the structural demand that is coming up with the rapid pace that India is growing with,
Mm.
right? And I think scaling green or renewable power requires a lot of reliability, a lot of consistency, and a lot of execution at scale. And what's been wonderful, and this is something I totally credit the government for, is they have been extremely proactive in partnering with Indian industry to ensure that this is something that we can jointly arrive at and jointly build together. Right. So from having the enabling policies, the enabling whether we talk about the MNRE at the center, to the different states and their policies. And I think this is one common agenda that everybody across the nation is very clear we have to get to, is a shift to green energy. And this also ensures energy security for a country like India. And for India to become one of the top three economies, for India to be what we want it to be at 2047, energy is going to grow exponentially. The energy needs of the country are going to need exponentially. And the best way to kind of service that is through renewable energy, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's now battery or hybrid formats, hydrogen, whichever way you look at it, right? Different things have to come in together to kind of make this work. So I fundamentally believe this is not a shift that can kind of happen overnight.
Mm.
It's a gradual transition where renewable energy becomes a part of the larger energy mix. But what India has been able to do has been able to show the scale at which we can develop this fairly quickly. I think when you look at the amount of solar capacity we have added in the country in the last 18 months, it has been the highest globally by far, right?
Mm.
When you look at the targets we set for 2030, we're well on our way to achieve that as well. And we'll probably achieve it much earlier than 2030. So I think industry, government, policy, on ground activation, grid infrastructure, all of these are moving in tandem. And I think when these things move in tandem, that's when you see exponential growth for an industry like this. And that's what we are seeing as well when we are building at RPSG, right, with Purva Green, which is our IPP arm for renewables. We've just started off with our first 300 megawatt of solar in Rajasthan, and the next 300 coming up next month. And then we're building, and we have a starting target of getting to 10 gigawatts in the next 5 years, and then we want to keep building more on this. And what's really heartening to see is it's when the whole ecosystem is really coming together. And so whether you look at it from a manufacturing capability, whether you're looking at it from a construction capability, whether you look at it from an actually dispatching of power capability, that becomes very important that all three things work in tandem. And I think that's been happening. And for us, we are very clear. We want to look at wind, solar, hybrids, battery, BESS, and really look at firm and dispatchable round the clock power, because ultimately that is what India needs. India's energy needs are much higher in the evenings than they are during the day, etc. So we have to ensure that the transition that happens has to happen keeping in mind where the energy demand is going to come from and how do we cater to that.
And I think this current global oil crisis or whatever is it getting you more excited to do more faster, or how are you seeing, India's energy transition goals, ambitions with the current, series of events? Are they just a passing phase? Does it worry you? How are you thinking of it?
So I think when you talk of energy transition, I think India has been extremely clear. The Prime Minister has been clear. The MNRE Minister has been clear. And I think overall, everyone in India is clear that this energy transition is not a short-term pivot because of anything. India's energy transition started 10 years ago. It didn't wait for this war to happen for us to realize we need to do it, right? And so I think it is natural. It's happening globally as well. And I think the speed and scale that India has to offer is unmatched by any other country in the world,
Yeah.
right? And I think that is the real distinction that India brings to the
Yeah.
table.
No, no, I think you're bang on there, and I think that's the power, which we will see getting unlocked. You're talking of the timelines and the scale at which that change is both demanded for and being executed. I think that's the excitement. Moving to another segment, and I know today we will switch between many segments, pretty unique in terms of a holistic conversation around, so many important and interesting sectors that, Shashwat, you're already a part of. So the consumer, retail, wellness, right? Totally shifted now with digital first brands, traditional businesses. And I know you mentioned, something there which is driven actually by customer preferences, right? I mean, the consumer is moving, and sometimes as companies, we feel we are just playing catch up, right? And on other
Yeah.
sides, you say, no, I'm going to shape what the consumer is going to do. And, technology shifts or disruptions are making that happen. And building successful consumer business in India is hard. Actually, it's hard anywhere in the world, right? And so the simple thing is, it's an ambition that many young people, entrepreneurs have, and we see a large part of our startup ecosystem, led by consumer tech, etc. Bringing smart, great people together. At the same time, traditional businesses making the shift. So when you think of scaling, consumer businesses, staying differentiated, and still building a competitive business that is sustainable over the long term. What are some of the things you think of, and what are some of those inputs you think that will be relevant for us again as a country as we go about building that?
So I think one of the things that's happened over the last 4, 5, 6 years now is the fact that data is available to everyone in the country, right? Everyone has a mobile phone in their hands, right? Everyone is connected to the net. And I think the telecom revolution kind of allowed that to be available at such cheap rates, right? Which just increased the access significantly. And with that, what's happened is consumers have started to be more aware and hence evolve much faster. And they continue to evolve even faster, right? So I think and along with this, if I was to add in the fact that the per capita growth in India has been consistent, right? So
Hmm.
it's inching up year over year, and I think by 2047 it would be much higher than a lot of the other economies in the world. So I think all of this coupled together increases the consumption overall of goods in India. And I think that's the larger theme that we are playing with. And the other theme that we are playing with is that historically, if you see, most brands were international brands that came into India and created them, right? Whether it was Unilever, whether it was P&G, they all brought in their American brands or European brands from there and popularize them in India, right? For us, the idea is how do you kind of build consumer brands first in India for India, like I was saying earlier, same theme, and then actually create them in a way that you become an Indian brand, which is a global brand available everywhere, similar to what the West did with us, right? Um, so we are building brands very rooted in local consumer insights. So since we're today building for India, we're building with very strong insights of what Indians like. So whether it's in the snack space, whether it's in the personal care space where we are doing hair care and face care, or whether it's in the herbal wellness space, which is moving into fitness and longevity, right? And there is another trend that we are clearly seeing, which is a trend towards aspiration and which is driving premiumization to some extent, right? So people are willing to pay more for quality products. And so that's another trend that they're playing on. And I think one big shift we've seen in the last 3 years is there has been a big digital pivot which has happened as far as how you can build businesses to an initial level of scale quickly. So historically, when you were trying to build a consumer brand, you would have to build a very large offline distribution network, which would take decades to build, right? Today, with the advent of e-commerce or quick commerce, you don't need to build your own distribution. You just need to list your product on these platforms and then market them. And if the consumer finds it to be relevant, then they actually purchase. And then if the product is good quality and consistent, giving good results, then they come back with repeats, right? So you can actually test your products and ideas much faster versus what it was till even pre-COVID, I would say, right? Where you had to build, and by the time you actually got feedback, it would be a couple of months delayed because the market feedback in an offline channel takes that long. So I think speed of building has gone up and speed of pivoting has also gone up, where you get feedback quickly, you can fail fast, learn fast, and pivot. So I think it's been a very interesting, or it is rather a very interesting time to build consumer brands in India. I also feel like consumerism is now starting to take shape. And just to build off the statistic where you said 111 people in the world are Indian, 65% of India is under the age of 35,
Yeah.
right? And a large chunk of that sits between 20 and 35. And that's the TG that we are targeting with our products, because that's the core of India, which will keep
Yeah.
growing and aging over the next 40, 50 years. And we want to be relevant to them at each life cycle of this.
Yeah, and we have four Indias also, right? Sitting at different
Absolutely.
levels in the per capita chain. So every time there's a shift, there are a few 100 million people,
People.
but which is a dream for any consumer brand anywhere in the world, right?
Exactly.
Where you add
Exactly.
it because of just the sheer, spending power that will get added.
Power. Yeah. Yeah.
I
And I
think
think
clearly, yeah. Go ahead.
from a demographic shift, like you said, we have four Indias, and historically the Indian pyramid was a very typical like triangular pyramid, right, where the large mass was what we call the Bharat, and then you
Yeah,
built on higher levels or aspirational levels. And I think what we are seeing now is that pivot happening to a diamond shape, right,
right, correct,
which is very interesting, actually means that the middle pie, which is where you know cons- where you could say purchasing power is much larger,
right.
is starting to become a large chunk of the
Yes.
Indian population. And I think as that happens more and more, I think you'll see a lot more Indian brands coming in.
Yeah, yeah. And this is also triggering the shift, right, for India to now, step up at the forefront of the world when it comes to technology. And so moving to, the other area of your, which has been typically, technology services, you mentioned BPO, but today when you look at, technology and AI and, making that shift, right, we've been a global leader, right, when it comes to technology services, business processes, outsourcing, etc. But with AI, it's fundamentally changing the narrative, right? And if we really look at this particular sector, the technology services sector, I mean, one big announcement in AI will just hit, a huge amount of market cap in a country which is right on the other side, because there is this aspiration or there is this hope in the future of this technology being absolutely disruptive. And I think nobody today can deny, when people spoke AI few years ago, there was, pessimists and there were optimists. Today, I think it's undeniable that, AI has become so integrated into, a person's life. I remember I was at NASA 35 years ago, and that time when we used to pick few frequencies and predict corn and derive intelligence, it was AI. But it was being used in very limited shapes and forms from data and machine learning. But today, the difference between a capable person and a not so capable person, at least going forward, will be a productive person and not so productive, however you want to define that, will be how much AI is that person willing to integrate into their life. So in a shift like this, which will be only more relevant over the next 2 decades, how do you see AI's role today, both from an India standpoint, and more importantly, what can we do, Shashwat, as a country, right, to ensure that we leverage AI for the larger good for India, inclusivity, etc. Any thoughts you might have there?
Absolutely. I think AI is the buzzword, and I think we're all toying with different uh, ways of how each of us can use AI, right? Both personally and professionally. So first, I'll just address, you spoke about the BPO space and how AI announcements kind of impact that. I think, the BPO industry in India kind of was built on a lot of cost arbitrage, right? That we had low cost, high quality employees who were extremely efficient. And that's something that other countries didn't have. And that's what we built on, right? AI kind of offers something very similar, right? So it does level the playing field across the world. So that is definitely a fact. But I think the way these companies will have to pivot is to move away from this whole concept of full-time employees and these are the number of full-time employees I'll give you to deliver your work, versus saying this is the work you want, this is the output I can provide you, with a combination of people and AI and people who use AI, right? And agentic AI and whichever way you look at it. And there is still a cost arbitrage to be had. There is still an efficiency arbitrage to be had. And that's what we kind of need to play on. So for us, actually, at First Source, what we've done is we've converted the whole company now, and our company is now officially called the UnBPO company, where we are now a solutions partner to our clients and partners versus being a back-end outsourcing partner, right? So we've created our own versions like Rel AI, First Sense AI, and these are not just tech experiments. We're actually using them live at scale to provide solutions that reshape how we are kind of delivering value to our global clients, right? But coming to your second question on AI in India, I think the advantage that we in India have is today as we start building for scale, right? And India is just starting to build at massive scale now with the kind of economic progress we've been seeing, with the kind of GDP growth we've been seeing, and with the kind of um, you know industry government partnership that now is there. So I think we're at a very pivotal point where, as we start creating what the future of business and different businesses will look like, India can embed AI into a lot of workflows, into a lot of how India thinks, into a lot of how India can use AI to pivot exponentially. And I always feel like India has always been good at jugaad. And what is really jugaad, right? I'll explain it to you in my way. Is basically saying, if you have a problem and you have ambiguous solutions or ambiguous ways of arriving at it, Indians are the best to think really outside the box, find a way to make things work so that your end outcome is achieved, right? So I actually feel Indians will be able to use AI significantly more intelligently than the rest of the world will. And I think they will therefore be able to, or we will therefore be able to kind of leverage it much, much better, much more at scale. 1.4 billion people is not something anyone else in the world can offer, right? And therefore, you will see India's growth becoming much faster on the back of AI.
No, I think you have used the word jugaad, and I think it's such an important thing because it comes up in many conversations, right? Our lack of that last mile, as the Japanese would say, that perfection is missing, actually is what creates that space within which innovation and so many things can happen,
Happen.
at a much more rapid speed, right? Because you're not stuck to decisions for you are willing to experiment, willing to innovate, and more so with young people, right, who relatively carry a better risk, lower risk, they can take greater risks when you're younger, and in countries like India, which are growing and which have so many problems that need solutions,
Yeah.
right? And I think BPO being positioned as a solutions provider to the world, that that capability enables us to probably do that. And it's a great interesting insight when you think of how we will apply AI differently from the rest of the world, and that will become the new language model for the rest of the world to probably take up. Yeah.
And I feel like a young demographic dividend, right? The younger people that we have, they will also we will be able to leverage AI a lot better because we have a huge amount of youth population,
Yeah.
right? And historically, when you look at it, whether you look at Japan, whether you look at China, when those countries pivoted to becoming extremely large economies, that happened when a large chunk of their population was the youth in a way, right? Or under 40.
Correct.
And
Correct.
India today is in that space. So I
Yeah.
think the next 20 years are really India's
Yeah.
2 decades in a way.
Yeah, and that actually is a great segue to the last business area of yours, which we are going
Okay.
to discuss, which is, this entire, youth culture, sports, cinema,
Mhm.
digital content, giving an opportunity for young people today to actually become creators, earn their own livelihoods, be it, initiatives in music and others. Sports franchises are creating new athletes, new, ways for people to earn livelihoods, right? And you are doing that. This is the IPL season. You can imagine the excitement of the country, and you're playing such a key role. Not only in being a part of that, but giving it that economic push, right? That soft power in India needs. So when someone like you or a group like yours enters into this space or looks at it, from a maybe a cultural standpoint, but also from shaping that, what does it bring to your group, right? What do you do through this mechanism? Is it just the of course the financial outcomes also we are seeing are very significant, but I'm saying, what more does it do, right, beyond that, to a country, in a country like India, when it comes to these kinds of businesses?
India has historically always been very high on the culture quotient, right? And I think that's what's defined India's soft power. And today, what's changing is India's soft power is actually becoming another economic engine for India's growth, right? And I think that is what is driving a lot of soft power businesses in a way to come to the forefront, right? For us, whether you look at it in sports, for example. So with cricket, the idea, of course, I think the business model is clear to everybody, right? I know when we invested in it, people were like, "Oh, it's a grossly overpaid, like, it's a huge premium." But look at it today; we're sitting not even 5 years from that day, and the values are more than double, right? So I think it just shows you the economic power that things like sports, things like media, entertainment, film, music have, right? And we've always been, say, for example, invested in Indian culture through Saregama, which was a music company, which is now pivoted from not just music to looking at films to looking at entertainment, and really covering the entire spectrum of what soft power or what cultural power could look like, right? And for us, they are not standalone bets. I think it's about building a platform that's deeply engaging with consumers, and we're also trying to create communities, right, over time, which are different consumer cohorts in a way. So it's also about bringing grassroots talent and giving them national presence and international presence and a platform which allows us as a company to display India's strengths on culture, on music, on media, on entertainment at a global scale, right? Um, and I think that's one distinction that again India has to offer. The kind of talent we have across all of these, it's very different, and it is a unique driver of Indian identity, which can build a long-term brand for India. So that's how we look at this entire segment.
No, I think, and I think we also play a little bit in these spaces, and I
Yes.
completely agree with you. The opportunity for new forms of sports, right? Like we have esports and, e-cricket, and
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
played so many different things. Like if you see what you're talking in terms of value creation, the soft power of, creating jobs and skills, right? The India orange economy or the entire discussion about creative industries creating 2 million jobs by 2030 is a big ambition that India has put out. Because
Mm.
once that is unlocked, it is these creative people who will now create new jobs. Because, a top end creator needs, their lyricists, they need their hairstylists, they need, so many things that go around that to create, new segments of jobs which, never existed before, right? And I think these are the advantages and, both the opportunities, also the challenges, right? Because AI
Yeah.
might, like what you said with agentic AI, take away jobs. But, at the end of the day, I think, when it comes to unlocking our country's power, where we started, I think the key is going to be development of human capital, right? It's our people. I think both you and I very clearly believe it's the young of this country, is
Yeah.
the youth power. And how do we ensure that the right capacity is built in that, in the country through those people? They could become entrepreneurs creating top 100 companies like you, or others who are going to, unlock and unleash their best, in this global process of creating value, both for India and through India for the world. But when it comes to your view on young people, on talent, you work with professionals in your organizations, culturally, right? As RPSG, as well as, as an Indian company which is, giving leadership to development of the workforce. How what are some of the things that India should, be focused on, right? I mean, we often talk of leaders globally, having, say, you need a clear thinking head and clean working hands. But, in India, you'll add a warm, caring heart, right? Or, I'm just saying
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
ways of
Absolutely.
leadership, young people. How should we be thinking of some of these issues as a country?
So I'll tell you how we look at it at RPSG, right? For us, I think the most important and fundamental pillar of our growth, of our success, of our ambitions is talent. And I think we believe that is key for us to be able to achieve absolutely anything and everything, right? So we really focus a lot on building systems that will help identify talent, that will help develop talent, that will help groom talent to be able to kind of take risks, to be able to take conscious calls on what should be the next thing that they do, what should be the next thing that the organization does. And for us, therefore, it's very important to create an environment where even the professionals we work with can work with a very high entrepreneurial spirit, right? So it's not about kind of well, let me say it's more about we spend a lot of effort and energy in ensuring that they believe one that this is their organization, and more importantly that they can go ahead, take decisions, take risks, and they don't have to be worried to fail. Because if they fail, we are okay if they were to learn fast and pivot, versus in an organization where if you fail you are um, that may be your end. And for us that's not at least how we think about it. So I think investing in people, investing in capability, I think is central to what we believe is important. And that's how we kind of think through decades versus thinking quarter to quarter. And just on your point on you mentioned very briefly, I think that AI is taking jobs. I'm not agreeing or denying, but I have a different take on this as well. Is with every revolution that happened, right? Whether you look at the industrial revolution or the digital revolution or now the AI revolution, every time there was a machine that kind of came in to make some process easier, right? Which was earlier being done by people, right? And so there was always this fear that if the machine does the job faster, better, more efficiently, the people will go out of jobs. But if you look at the data, with each of these revolutions, employment only increased. The number of jobs only increased, right? It was just about using that technology and doing your job better with the use of that technology. So I fundamentally still feel AI will also be an enabling technology. And if you really get into the nuance of at least what AI today is as a large language model or a small language model, and this is something very interesting. So we did a workshop recently for all the senior leaders in the group on AI, and we had one of the global heads from one of the leading AI companies who was here, and they were talking about it, and they were saying, "Do not use AI to strategize. Do not use AI for this. Do not use AI for that," which is very counterintuitive for an AI company to be saying. And when we probe further, they said the AI model is actually built to predict just the next word. And so it's just a different we all use AI very differently, right? We're outsourcing a lot of it, and I still believe in 3 to 5 years AI will kind of commoditize intelligence
Correct.
in a way, right? But what it will never be able to bring that human angle to it, and thinking outside the box, because an LLM works on past data, so it's not able to innovate necessarily always.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
it'll be about how effectively you use AI, I think, and that will change.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with the generative part of AI, where it's becoming smarter and based on the past, we're able to pretty like how human
Yeah,
intelligence works. And I think I'm completely aligned with you on when I said AI will take your jobs. AI will take your jobs in a way that if me, with AI were to
yeah,
compete for a job that somebody is doing without AI today, right?
absolutely.
I will take that person's job.
Yes,
Right? Or if
absolutely.
I was the other guy, that person will take my job, and therefore having AI as your companion, or ignoring that is not an option. And I completely, like, you look at global world GDP, right? The way it has scaled and grown with every new evolution, right? Internet came and now we have $100 trillion global economy. So there is no question the world will continue to grow, jobs will continue, opportunities will continue, but for people to realize the agility with which they need to be able to adapt, adopt, learning, studying, education the way it was, and now you're a lifelong learner. It doesn't matter, you're learning through your senses all the time, but, you actually put that extra effort to make that happen and completely align on the way you think. And I think we both, kind of think on these lines similarly, like many others, in India. I think the more we talk to people, the more we look at the future, the good part, which I see is a strength of India, is this common shared understanding of both the power of India and the ability to be able to shape that future. And I think this is a viral effect that we want Indians and young people in India to carry. And at a time when the West is actually not being very accepting of young people, or people there, I think it's a great opportunity for young people to invest their time, effort in India and build things in India, work in India, spend more time. So when you have to give a message to the youth of this country, and we'll end with that. I can keep talking, and we know that we can go on. Uh, what is that message that you would like to give young people of India?
Hmm. Um, Again, I'll tell you how I think about this. Right? What message would I give myself? Like, I would say a couple of things. I would say think long term, because India's future is very bright. But start acting now, right? I think it's extremely important to not just overly optimize for the short term, but build for sustained impact. The second thing I would tell them is small steps compound over time, right? So don't be scared to take that small step. I feel like today, a lot of people, including sometimes myself, you always like, but should we do this? If we do this, this could go wrong, that could go wrong. Or if we do it, maybe the outcome is only incremental, not exponential, right? But I feel like as you keep taking steps ahead, you can over time compound them to get something which is exponential, right? So today, your North Star may not be very obviously clear to you in terms of how you will get there. But if you don't take that first step, you'll never reach that North Star, right? And I think third would be, um, maybe from a talent standpoint, if I say building at scale, is don't just look at employing talent. I think that's the wrong mindset, at least from a business standpoint. I think of deploying talent in a bigger way, right? And how do you create ownership, a sense of ownership, a sense of entrepreneurialness? How do you create an environment where they can thrive? And that's a shift that I'm seeing from older age companies to newer age companies. And 74% of India's workforce is going to be Gen Zs in the next 5 years, right? And under the age of 30, 32, which is a big shift because the way that generation thinks is very different from the way, say, you and I think, right? So we have to start thinking and building for them so that while the vision may be common and you can sell a vision, the way to arrive at that vision is where the alignment needs to happen.
No, I think, very powerful message. And, as you were talking about this, I think it's not only the entrepreneurial mindset that we need, in young people, is the entrepreneurial mindset we need as a country, right? When
I
we
mean,
think of India and India at 2047, what does an entrepreneur do, right? Limited resources, high aspirations, and therefore you have to find innovative ways to get there. And I think that's really the journey of India from
yeah,
2026 to 2047.
37.
One thing we got to keep in mind is the non-negotiables, like we would in business keep profit and others or whatever are our capital allocation or talent. The non-negotiables for India continue to remain, things like including everybody in the journey, looking at power and sustainability and all of that very differently, ensuring that, we are able to operate with values and a rule of law, which is, significantly important from a global context, and many such non-negotiables that we will all have to abide and live by together in this journey of a spirited creation of India. But Shashwat, thank you for triggering so many unique ideas, so many wonderful things and thoughts that I'm sure not only the listeners, CII, and everybody who's thinking about India and its future, will use in various forms over the next 2 decades. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, and I just want to say this is just the beginning. We'll continue to work together through CI and many other platforms to help, shape and use your, time, effort, knowledge, and commitment to India over the years to come. So again, thank you so much. And you can see so many thumbs ups coming because it's truly been a very energizing and wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arjun. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah,
And looking forward to working together.
likewise. Back to you.